Good afternoon. I'm Nancy Tawana, the director of the Rock Ethics Institute, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here today to the Social Justice and the Economy lecture series. This is the last lecture of our series this semester, but I'd like to begin by reminding you that we continue on next semester with a group of equally exciting speakers. On January 29th, Joan Acker will be joining us here to give a talk entitled, "Is Ethical Capitalism an Oxymoron?" So please think about putting that on your calendar and joining us in January. This lecture series is actually the brainchild of our speaker today. So I'd like to begin by thanking her for giving so much thought and attention to this lecture series even before she stepped foot on campus. Professor Sandra Morgen is a professor in women's studies who joined us just this fall, but worked with me all last year to think about how to put together and frame a lecture series that would enable all of us to think about the ethical issues involved in inequities in income, wealth, and power, and how we might, as individuals as well as a society, rethink the types of structures that hold these types of inequities in place. Professor Morgen is trained as an anthropologist, and her research focuses on the intersection of gender, race, and class in U.S. social and economic policy. Before she came here, she served for 15 years as the director of the Center for the Study of Women in Society, and I had the great good fortune to work with her when she was director of that center, and she is an administrator without comparison nationally. I have to admit to being just a tad biased because she's also my best friend, but I speak truth. She continues to head a research initiative on women and economic structuring that focuses on welfare and poverty through the University of Oregon, and has a series of books. Her most recent ones include Taxes Are a Women's Issue, Into Our Own Hands, The Women's Health Movement in the United States, 1969 through 1990, and Work, Welfare, and Politics, Confronting Poverty in the Wake of Welfare Reform. She's been very well recognized for her work and for her achievements, and I'll just mention two. She received a Women Who Make a Difference Award from the National Council for Research on Women in 2004, and an award for outstanding contributions to the field of anthropology in the United States. So if any of you need proof that you can be an academic and succeed in the standards that they hold us to in the academy, and at the same time make a difference in the world and be an activist, this woman proves that it's possible. So welcome her here today.
But she still loses her thumb drive before the talk. So thank you, Nancy, and all of you for being here. I really want to thank the Rock Ethics Institute. It certainly made my coming here much more welcoming to be able to just jump right in to do something this valuable, this much fun as putting together a lecture series. And I also want to thank the Rock Ethics Institute staff, Kathy Rumba and Barb Edwards. So what I'm going to do today is try and walk you through some information about the tax system, because most of us, well, how many of you feel like you really understand the U.S. tax system? Okay, so not too many. And then get to an analysis of concepts like ownership and citizenship and inequality. But I want to say, first of all, that I didn't wake up one day and go, oh, I want to study taxes. That is not how it happened. What happened is I was doing work on welfare and poverty, and both my policy work and my scholarship made me realize that feminist and other scholarships outside of economics and the academy had really ignored, to our peril, I think, an understanding of fiscal and especially tax policy. And so I began to do work in it. I was appointed to be the head of an advisory committee on economic justice at the National Council for Research on Women. We put out an RFP trying to get somebody to write this book, this report. And anyway, to make a long story short, it didn't happen, and Mimi Abramowitz and I did. So I'm obsessed right now with taxes and find them incredibly interesting, and I hope you will too by the end of today. I also want to mention that I think we all know, when we look at the political scene out there, that there are a lot of hot button social issues, and that when we talk about ethics and morals today in the U.S. political discourse, we tend to hear that conversation around things like abortion, family values, welfare, affirmative action, and most recently stem cell research. I'm going to argue that ethics and morals apply equally, if not more so, to the field of the economy, and particularly to the tax structure, a much less sexy topic, but one to which, at least in the last quarter century, the whole question of ethics has become pretty much backburnered. That was not the case earlier in the century. In the early 20th century, during the age of populism, progressive movement, taxes were a very hot issue, and they were framed very much in terms of ethics, the ethics of income and wealth distribution in this country. And those issues remained very important to the labor movement and to a variety of other social movements until the period after World War II, and particularly got transformed, as you'll see, in the period right after the 1980s. These are the questions I want to look at today. How has the pattern of wealth and income inequality changed since 1980, and what does this have to do with tax policy? I'm going to talk about a concept called fiscal welfare. I'm going to talk about how changing tax policy is related to gender, race, and class inequalities, and to the changing meanings of citizenship, economic justice, and the government that animate both anti-tax and tax justice movements in this country. And I want to raise a series of ethical issues at the end of the talk. So this is the cover of a book by David K. Johnson, a wonderful book called Perfectly Legal, mainly about corporate tax breaks. I'm not going to be talking about those today. But I wanted to start with this image because I think it says two very important things. First of all, it should be fairly obvious from looking at it that all the images here are pretty much of whites and of men. And that's sort of how the tax system has been hammered out, pretty much by white men up until quite recently. And then secondly, I think you would probably agree that the sort of undertone of this image is one of negativity, money coming out of one's pockets, taxes as bad things, and that's a very common discourse in the country. So I probably shouldn't go there yet. Don't focus too much on that. What I want to do is look at what has happened, particularly since 1980, both to income and wealth inequality and to tax policy. And I wanted to start with this because I think it's a very compelling image of the kinds of changes that we're talking about. This is from Kevin Phillips' book, Wealth and Democracy. And what it does is it shows you that from 1947 to 1973, real family income growth was substantial across the income quintiles. That's how a lot of economists talk about this. They divide everybody up into 5 quintiles, the upper, down to the lower. Amazingly so, the lowest fifth had the largest family income, real income growth in that period, the post-war period. The pattern changes dramatically from 1973 to 2000. I think it's pretty obvious. We have not only a change in who has the most income growth, but in the difference between the different quintiles. And this is the context that I'm going to be talking about today. This is another way of looking at it for those of you that like other kinds of graphics. This is the same kind of thing. You see the top 5% going up, starting right around the 1980s, and the bottom 40% going down. And this one, since the other slides kind of stopped around 2000, this looks at what's going on with income inequality in the period 2002-2003. And this is important because this is after the two most recent tax cuts under the current administration, big tax cuts in 2001 and 2003. And this shows income gains, again, being concentrated very much at the top. And we're going to talk about this a little bit more. But those are the sort of, that's the economic context that I'm looking at. Income is different from wealth. I can't go into this in too much detail, but if income inequality in this country is significant, is highly polarized, wealth inequality is even more so. There you see the champagne glass as opposed to the hourglass context for wealth being very much concentrated at the top. A couple of facts about the U.S. distribution of wealth. The most common measure is that, how much wealth is owned by the richest 1% of households. Right now, it's in 1998, it was 38% of all wealth just in the top 1%. The richest 5% owned more than half of all wealth, and the richest 20% owned over 80% of all wealth. The poorest 20% typically not only have no wealth, they are deeply in debt. A household in the middle has wealth valued at about $62,000 compared to the average wealth in the top 1%, which is $12.5 million. And a big part of that $62,000 is in home equity with some additional assets in savings accounts, CDs, etc. If we look at non-home wealth, the top 1% holds 50% of all non-home wealth in this country, and the richest 10% of families own 85% of all stocks, financial securities, and 90% of business assets. The average African American family has only 18% of the wealth of the average white family. Gender's complicated because most assets are jointly held, but if you look at single women and female-headed households, they have much less wealth than married couples. I'm not going to go into this in too much detail, but many economists measure economic inequality using a measure called the Gini coefficient. The United States has one of the highest Gini coefficients of the developed world. In other words, one of the highest degrees of income inequality. Okay, so it's important. So you have all of that in your minds. You probably knew that anyway, but it's important to see it in black and white. So, why? What's going on, and what does tax policy have to do with this? I can't say that tax policy is the only reason, and it may not even be the main reason for the kind of inequalities we're talking about. The complex effects of global economic restructuring on jobs and wages is very much part of the equation. The unprecedented rise in the pay of CEOs since the 1980s. Changes in finance capital and other changes like this are also very important. But tax policy has something to do with it. And what I think has happened in the last 25 years is that there's been a major paradigm shift, economic paradigm shift in this country. And I see it as a shift from a Keynesian to a neoliberal policy regime. And I'm not going to be talking about all of Keynesian economics. I'm using the term in a very particular way. Keynesian policies, Keynesian social welfare policies provided limited economic security to citizens and residents through tax-supported public programs at the federal, state, and local level. And those policies emerged, many of you probably know, in the 1930s, both in this country and in Europe. The basic structure of the U.S. welfare state has always distinguished between means-tested programs for the poor, in other words, you had to be income eligible for them, and then a whole variety of other programs that are social insurance programs that are much more universal. Social Security, unemployment insurance, Medicare are the major social insurance programs. And these all were have been part of this sort of Keynesian welfare state. Racism, sexism, and other inequalities have been very much entrenched in the structure of the welfare state. And this is, again, something that I could spend an hour talking about. But briefly, because of how discrimination in the labor force positions men and women, whites and people of color, to have access, how they are positioned in the labor force, they have access, therefore, to different kinds of welfare state programs. And the poor, women, and people of color, and those are overlapping and intersecting, but not the same groups, have been channeled towards the much less generous, much more stigmatized, means-tested programs. I'm not going to go into that. Okay, so that's sort of the basic Keynesian welfare state model. The underlying principle of the welfare state is that citizens have a social right to some degree of protection from the market, from capitalism, and the inequalities and permanent or temporary economic hardships it generates through public assistance, social welfare, social insurance, and other kinds of public investments, such as in education, the healthcare system, and the like. Social citizenship was a foundational concept to much of not only the welfare state, but to sort of the Keynesian paradigm for most of the 20th century, both in the United States and in Europe. Now, things began to, and it's very important to understand that these are redistributive policies. They transfer resources from those with more, who pay more into the tax system, to those with less. There's a lot of support, has been a lot of support, not only among people at the bottom or the middle, but many people at the top for welfare state policies, because of the benefits to individuals, because of the benefits to sort of social order and social stability, and because Keynesian ideas suggested that more money in the pockets of consumers was good for the economy. So for the economy, for social order, and for individuals, there was a lot of support for the welfare state. And, of course, there's the little matter of the Cold War and the fact that capitalists in this country were kind of worried about if they didn't have some degrees of protection for people in the period after the Great Depression, that there might be more radical concerns about the kind of economic system we had. So there was, like I said, cross-class support for the welfare state. What's happened in the last quarter century is a neoliberalization of the state, a shift from Keynesian to neoliberal policies that have included tax structures that favor capital accumulation over income redistribution, industrial policies that minimize the presence of the state in private industry, and retrenchment in welfare spending. These sort of neoliberalism comes by many names, and there's a lot of distinctions between supporters of neoliberalism, but they tend to be free market or monetarist economic theories and policies. Milton Friedman, who just died a couple weeks ago, being one of the main ones, Friedrich Hayek and others. And these theories began to gain political support in the 1980s for complicated reasons that we can talk about if you want to later, in the context of intensifying globalization and the end of the Cold War and the declared triumph of capitalism. Neoliberal policy agendas are strongly associated with conservative and Republican public policy agendas, especially the contraction of the welfare state, the privatization of resources, services, and programs, strong support of individual private property rights and free trade and the free market. But it is not limited to Republicans. Bill Clinton is a classic neoliberal and signed one of the most important neoliberal pieces of legislation we've had, the Welfare Restructuring Act. At the core of neoliberalism is the ideology of economic freedom. Economic rights, economic freedom come, especially for owners of capital, property, corporations, and businesses who are presumed to have the resources to grow the economy, end up defined in opposition to or undermined by government regulation and redistributive tax policies. You've heard this over and over. This is not news. There is an emphasis in neoliberal policy on reducing taxes and government regulation, including a whole variety of protections for working people. And what this has led to is an erosion of social citizenship. Economic freedom in the ideology of neoliberalism supersedes social citizenship rights in the name of economic growth and the desirability of what's called personal rather than social responsibility. You see ideological definitions of recipients of many social welfare programs as undeserving, unproductive dependents, as poverty is promoted by social welfare policies rather than by the dynamics of the labor market or the economy, and of public sector programs as inefficient and drains on taxpayers. We've heard this over and over in the last 25 years. So quickly, the neoliberal policy regime in the post-90s United States is tax cuts and deregulation, free trade, contracting the welfare state, and we're going to talk in a few minutes about the sort of emergence of this concept of the ownership society. Okay, I'm going to skip that one. Let's talk about taxes and how that fits into this agenda. A couple of quick definitions. Progressive taxes are based on the ability to pay. The rate at which your income is taxed increases as your income goes up. You know this, right? Proportional or flat taxes means the same rate is applied to all income. That would be something like the Social Security, the FICA, or the concept of a flat tax that's been floated recently. And regressive taxes take a larger percentage of income from those with lower incomes. That'd be things like the sales tax, but there are others as well. All right, what has happened since the 1980s is that the quite progressive, historically progressive federal income tax structure has become significantly less progressive, i.e. more regressive. It's happened in a number of ways. First of all, there have been reductions, very significant reductions in the tax rate on the highest bracket from 91% in the 50s and early 60s to 71% in the mid-70s to 50% in 1982, and with the final tax cut bill in 2003 down to 35%. That's a very significant set of drops. We've also had a reduction in the number of brackets, meaning that the system is less sensitive to income differences. There were 25 brackets between World War II and the 1970s, 15 in 1982, and we're down to 6 in 2004. There's a huge reduction on taxes on unearned income. That's not what you make when you go out and work. It's what you make from investments. Capital gains, that's what you gain when you profit from selling something. Those rates have fallen from 39% in the mid-1970s to 20% in 1998 to 15% in 2003. Dividend taxes, which that's what you get when you're a shareholder and a corporation gives you a distribution, that used to be taxed just at the same rate as your regular income. So if you were in the 35% bracket, they took 35%. Now it's a flat 15% in 2003 for most taxpayers. And then there have been estate tax changes. In 2001, the top marginal rate for estate taxes was cut to 45%, and a much bigger amount of wealth was exempted. In addition, there's been a shrinking of the corporate income tax. Between 1962 and 2000, Congress cut the top corporate tax rate from 52% to 35%, and in 2000, an estimated 94% of U.S. corporations and 89% of foreign corporations paid less than 5% of their total income in taxes because of these reductions. At the same time, payroll taxes are going up, and that's what most working stiffs, most of us mostly are taxed on. Payroll taxes are flat on income up to $90,000. So we all, whether we make $15,000 or $90,000, we're paying the same percentage on our payroll taxes. If you make $91,000 or more, all that income above $90,000 is not taxed at all. There's no money taken out for payroll taxes on that money. Payroll tax increases have been significant. They've doubled since 1960. And if you look at this, you see a very interesting pattern. You see the decline in the share of the federal tax burden paid by corporations and the rising share represented by payroll taxes. These are not making up, these don't necessarily make up for each other. The payroll taxes go into the Social Security Trust Fund, but it's just an indication of what's going up and what's going down. I'm not going to talk at all about state and local taxes, except to say they're almost always more regressive than federal taxes, much more reliance on flat and proportional taxes. As a result, low and moderate income families pay a much higher percentage of their income in state and local taxes than the rest of us. In 2002, the top 1% of tax filers paid only 5.2% of their income in those taxes, compared to 11% for the poorest families. Now, lots of people talk about what I've just been talking about, but we tend to talk about taxpayers as though they're all the same. Everybody looks the same, everybody acts the same, everybody is the same, except as we're differentiated by income and wealth. What Mimi and I did in working on this book, Taxes Are a Women's Issue, is we wanted to begin to sort of break down that generic taxpayer and look and see how women in particular might be differently affected than men by tax policy. And with a great deal of effort, we were able to get data from the 2003 that shows how concentrated women are in the lower quintiles. 63% of the lowest quintile, of the lowest 20%, versus 41% in the top quintile. So as wealth goes up, the percentage of women in the quintile goes down. Okay? And we know, although we can't get the data by race because of the way this data is captured, we know that families of color are disproportionately represented in those lower quintiles based on poverty rates, wage, income, and wealth data. But I can't do the percentage the same way as I could for women. So what that means is that different taxpayers are differently affected by different tax policies that benefit that benefits you differently depending upon whether you're at the top or the bottom of the tax structure. So when we begin to think about who has benefited and who is lost from neoliberal tax policies, we hear all the time that who has benefited is the average or ordinary taxpayer. That's the rhetoric that comes at us. I think I've just shown you that that's not the case. But here's another way of looking at it. This is the value of tax cuts enacted since 2001. And you can see how it provides lopsided benefits to the wealthy. The average value of those tax cuts to those in the lowest 20% is $23. The average for the middle is $748. The average for the top 20% is $5,000, a little over $5,000. But that top 20% isn't like the other quintiles. The range in that top 20% is enormous. And if you break it down, you look at the top 1%, the value of those tax cuts was over $39,000, and for millionaires, it was over $100,000. So we're talking about cuts that did not benefit the ordinary taxpayer to any of the same degree that it did the more wealthy. And that means that people of color and women who are disproportionately in the lower quintiles certainly did not benefit to the same degree as others. Now, tax cuts are going to have already and are going to lead to very significant spending cuts. They already have. We've seen cuts in programs ranging from Pell Grants to welfare spending to public education to public health to veterans benefits, you name it. If it isn't the military, it's been cut. Actually, the major cuts are going to come now because there was a kind of masking of many of these cuts by a very strong propensity to borrow as opposed to cut programs. Programs were cut, but there was a lot of borrowing that masked some of that. If you look at the tax cuts versus the social program cuts that are coming, the savings, this is from two members of the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, two economists. They say the savings in 2005 through 2009 from all of the domestic discretionary cuts combined, that does not include the mandated programs like Medicaid, et cetera. Discretionary programs are the non-mandated programs, okay? The savings would be substantially less than the cost in those years of the income tax cuts for just the 1% of households with the highest incomes. What I want to do here is show you that it's a real trade-off here. Spending cuts will be paid for by the people who need those programs, and they will benefit those whose taxes have been significantly reduced and therefore are not going to be going to those programs. Neoliberal tax policies amplify gender, race, and class inequalities in a number of ways. First of all, lower income families, disproportionately female-headed and of color, who gained little from the tax cuts are going to be the big losers when the social programs are cut. These social program cuts also increase the care work responsibilities which are disproportionately shouldered by women. If there are not social and human services, somebody is going to be taking care of the mess that's left. And women and people of color are disproportionately employed in public sector jobs, which are the jobs that are going to be lost as social program cuts are enacted, or wages will be frozen, or benefits will be reduced, etc. In 2000, the public sector employed 20% of all women workers compared to only 13% of male workers and 22% of African American women workers. So a whole nother level and way that women and people of color are going to be disproportionately affected. So where we are to this point is that the particular tax policy changes and cuts that have been enacted since 1980 and which have lopsidedly benefited the wealthy play some role in the redistribution of income and wealth. But unlike the period that we looked at the beginning from 47 to 1980, the direction of redistribution is up rather than down the income ladder. While the wealthy for sure still pay the largest share of taxes, and while the progressivity of the income tax has not been completely eliminated, it has declined. And the tax cuts, especially those that have been enacted since 2000, are going to lead to a lot of program cuts. So what that's mainly going to do is cut social welfare programs, cut the social welfare state. That's a lot of what these discretionary programs are. Now, not all aspects of the welfare state are going to be cut, and this is the most controversial part of what I'm going to tell you today. Because what has happened, in addition to the declining progressivity of the tax structure, is that what we call fiscal welfare, and I'm going to define it for you in a minute, is being expanded. So what is fiscal welfare? Fiscal welfare is an indirect and to very many people not a very visible system of providing benefits to individuals and corporations through tax exemptions, credits, and deductions. Like the social welfare system, fiscal welfare is designed to provide for the well-being of the population. But it happens not through direct spending, but through the tax structure, the tax code. Tax credits, exemptions, and deductions work by lowering your tax liability. So if you're in the 35% tax bracket, you're not being taxed on all your income because you get to reduce that income through these various tax credits, exemptions, and deductions. It's not just Sandy Morgan that sees things this way, luckily. The Joint Committee on Taxation of the U.S. Congress agrees with me. It recognizes that what these things together, exemptions, deductions, and credits, are called tax expenditures. It's a counterintuitive word. We think it means budget expenditures, but it's not. It's tax expenditures, okay? The Joint Committee recognizes that these tax expenditures are, quote, analogous to direct outlay programs, meaning they function as public subsidies available to those taxpayers that can take advantage of them. We know these colloquially as tax breaks, okay? And all of us, or many of us get them. I hope you can see this. Can you see it at all? Maybe I should put the light down a little. How do you do that? Because this is an important slide. Does that make it better? Okay. So this helps us understand what I'm talking about. In the first column, you see direct outlays for social welfare programs. That's cash assistance, food stamps, unemployment insurance, Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare, rent supplements, Section 8 housing, government-subsidized child care programs, free primary school, et cetera, et cetera. This is what we're used to thinking of the welfare state. This is all these programs and more. WIC, et cetera. The fiscal welfare system does the same thing. Basic income support, you get it through things like deductions for dependents, the child tax credit, the earned income tax credit. Retirement, instead of going, we know Social Security under social welfare, but these are tax-free retirement accounts, IRAs, pensions, etc. Healthcare, there's deductions for insurance premiums and medical expenses that exceed 7.5% of gross income, the new medical savings accounts, tax breaks for businesses that provide health insurance for their employees. In the area of housing, there's deductions for mortgage interest, state and local property taxes, there's a child care tax credit, and there's now a whole new series of exemptions and credits to help afford education. So you see what we have here are the two systems side by side meeting many of the same needs, although often for very different people. It's a very complex system. Now, the impact of fiscal welfare, by the way, this is a good thing. I'm not saying this is a bad thing necessarily. It's just a different thing, and it's welfare. It's a way in which we all who benefit from these things are getting a public subsidy because we are paying fewer taxes and therefore having more money in our pocket because the government is subsidizing these activities for us and allowing us to lower our tax liability. Now, the impact is enormous of these tax expenditures. We're not talking about a small set of revenue number. In 2002, $609 billion was spent on these fiscal welfare programs. Many more than these. These include the corporate welfare programs that I'm not even going into, okay? But $609 billion did not go into the Treasury because of these tax breaks. That's $320 billion more than was spent on all non-defense discretionary spending, $323 billion than was spent on all means-tested program, and $156 billion more than was spent on Social Security. So we're talking about a very significant transfer of resources. In addition, fiscal welfare is more generous. I'm not going to go into the details of this. It's more generous. When when budget cuts need to be made, fiscal welfare is not on the table. It's not even it's not even considered by the same committees. What's chopped is discretionary spending, and these fiscal welfare programs just sit over there in the tax committee growing and growing and growing. On Friday, President Bush just signed a brand new set of corporate tax breaks in a bill that he signed with no public visibility. It was just sort of done in the office. Compare that to what happened in mid-October when a bill, the same kinds of, when another tax bill was signed that gave middle-class taxpayers some breaks. Televised, it was, da-da-da-da-da-da, tax breaks. But this bill, there's a tiny little article about it in the New York Times on Saturday. Tiny little article, very big set of tax breaks. Also, women are disproportionately represented not in the fiscal welfare programs, but in the social welfare programs, with the primary exception of the most important fiscal welfare program for low-income people, the Earned Income Tax Credit, which 1 out of 6 families in this country use now. It's mainly available to people with low and moderate incomes. And it is the major anti-poverty program in the country right now, and most people don't think of it as an anti-poverty program or a social welfare program. Race matters. It always matters, and it matters in fiscal welfare too. The late and wonderful Linda Fay Williams, an economist, a political scientist who just passed away 2 weeks ago, has done some really interesting work showing that African Americans are underrepresented both in key fiscal welfare programs and in social insurance programs. Here, she's able to show that the average tax benefits for credits or deductions were lower for African Americans, $2,000 annually lower for benefits from private pensions, $1,200 lower in educational tax benefits, and over $3,000 lower in mortgage interest tax deductions. So, once again, you see the race and gender inequalities texturing the fiscal welfare system as well. The construction of this dual welfare system, the social welfare and the fiscal welfare system, encourages those of us that receive fiscal welfare to feel entitled to our benefits as taxpayers. We don't even think of ourselves as getting public subsidies. But meanwhile, beneficiaries of social welfare programs are defined as taking money from taxpayers. And there's a very big political difference in how these are seen. Let me quickly show you an example of how this works in the area of housing. Tax expenditures for housing cost the Treasury almost twice as much in lost revenues as all direct spending for rental housing subsidies and public housing programs for low-income families. So this is the most popular aspect of fiscal welfare, the mortgage interest tax deduction. The top 10% of all homeowners by income receive 1/3 of all housing benefits, and the top 25% gets almost 60%. So who takes advantage of this? The home ownership rate for families headed by women is 16% lower than the rate for total home ownership, and home ownership rates for racial and ethnic minorities are 32% lower than the rate for total home ownership. Once again, in this area, you see gender and race at work. This is a complicated one. I'm not going to go into it. You can just take a quick look at it. What it shows is that as your income goes up and you have more money to spend on things, the tax benefit from that is significantly greater. So the average tax savings for the lowest income homeowners was $65 a year compared to tax savings of over $4,000 for the highest income homeowners. What we're trying to do here in talking about fiscal welfare is to make visible that there are public supports for middle and high income families, and disrupting this hegemonic cultural narrative about who gets support from the government, even though these tax expenditures are really below the radar screen for most people. This is a wonderful, I think, graphic. And I'm going to use it to introduce the last section of my talk. This was in the New York Times, and what it was with an article that was that was, I think, pretty effectively showing that we're in a paradigm shift. Okay, it's not just that these are a bunch of policies and they're different from what they were before, But we've got the New Deal, FDR, and the New Deal. And that's what I want to talk about. What is this New Deal? Earlier, I argued that the Keynesian paradigm was premised on the assumption that citizens have civil but also social rights, the latter being the right to a degree of social protection from economic hardship and insecurity. This is the concept I mentioned earlier of social citizenship that was coined by British sociologist Marshall, and he refers to it as the whole range of the right to a modicum of economic welfare and security, to the right to share in the full in the social heritage and to live the life of a civilized being according to the standards prevailing in society. Social citizenship rights have been very much part of our culture since the early part of the 20th century. These rights were based on the assumption that citizens enjoyed some degree of protection from the market, that some citizens performed socially valued labor and functions outside the market, such as care work, taking care of kids, taking care of sick people, etc., that were worthy of public support, and that the market couldn't be counted on to protect classes of individuals unable to compete or participate in the market: children, the elderly, the sick, the disabled, etc. In other words, social citizenship entailed the assumption that in addition to individual responsibility to be self-sufficient and to, make a living, there was a degree of social responsibility that the society had, particularly to those who were disadvantaged in or outside the market. Now, I'm not going to be naive and say that all was well during this period. That these benefits were often very miserly, and there were a lot of problems with all of these programs. That's not where I'm going now. I just want to admit it. But the concept of social citizenship really was very much a part of our country. Since the 1980s, Keynesian values and policies have been vigorously contested by a coalition of economic and political elites and advocates of a neoliberal iteration of capitalism that contends that in the context of the intensification of the global economic restructuring, that we need a new ethic of responsibility and a different model of citizenship and a different model of state-market relations. And this is the paradigm shift that I'm talking about. Rather than an ethic of social responsibility, neoliberalism valorizes personal responsibility and channels activity in the name of the social good to the market. In the neoliberal vision, economic growth is going to provide the jobs, the goods, the entrepreneurial spirit, and the shared abundance that's going to provide for individual and social well-being. Now, here, economic freedom substitutes for social citizenship, and neoliberal advocates are often very quiet on the realities of inequality, realities that I would argue are not just coincident with the market, but are actually built in and a source of great profit to people who are owners in the market. So let's look at the social vision a little bit more, proposed by some of the strong adherents of neoliberalism, and particularly as this paradigm has been enshrined in the concept of the ownership society. How many of you remember hearing about the ownership society? This was the key word for the second term of President Bush's domestic policy. He talked about the ownership society as the main goal of his second term, and he talked, and this, you haven't heard too much about it because there have been some other issues that have emerged, but it's very important. This is still very much on the agenda. So what is the ownership society? I'm going to first quote from the libertarian Cato Institute. An ownership society values responsibility, liberty, and property. Individuals are empowered by freeing them from dependence on government handouts and making them owners instead, in control of their own lives and destinies. In an ownership society, patients control their own health care, parents control their own children's education, and workers control their retirement savings. The concept of this ownership society, like I said, was the centerpiece of the domestic agenda for this second term. And at the core of it are tax cuts. And why? Because tax cuts give individuals the money to buy homes, invest in the stock market and health and private retirement accounts, and implement their entrepreneurial spirit by forming businesses to encourage economic growth. Tax cuts are at the core of the neoliberal agenda for the ownership society. The theory of these tax cuts is that they will promote economic growth through investment and consumption, and by leaving more of the taxpayer's money in his or her own pocket, they will allow the citizen consumer to purchase private goods and services and have more choice in that role as consumer. Theoretically, ownership society policies are designed to enhance individual choice and reduce reliance on the government. Interestingly, neoliberal adherents tend to gloss over what will happen to the millions of Americans who, with or without tax cuts, can't afford to purchase the private goods and services that they can't make up for that are cut when the social programs are cut. Presumably, as in welfare reform, they will be inspired by the lack of public services and programs to become more personally responsible, entrepreneurial, and well-off. That was the ideological rhetoric behind welfare reform. You hear the echo of it here in the ownership society. I can tell you from 8 years of studying welfare restructuring that it didn't quite work that way for many of those affected by welfare reform. They are not better off. They are not forming zillions of businesses and being entrepreneurial and being better off. But that, we can talk about that in a few minutes if you want. Social citizenship versus the ownership society. Social citizenship rights are eroded. Citizens can count on less social protection. The ideology of personal responsibility supersedes social responsibility, and you have the contraction, I would argue, of social citizenship. There's a lot of questions that I think emerge that are ethical questions. I really am getting towards the end. And I thought I would raise some of them and answer a couple, or not even answer, but address a couple of them, and then we could talk about them in discussion. If gender, race, class, and other inequalities are produced and reproduced within the capitalist market, who wins and loses when the social programs and regulatory mechanisms that were instituted by the state, almost always in response to social movement activism catalyzed by a critique of inequality, are dismantled? If economic opportunity and insecurity continue to be inequitably distributed because of racism or sexism or oppressive class relations, is the rhetoric of economic freedom really just a thinly veiled justification for growing wealth and income inequalities? Does, and if so to what extent, does the contraction or elimination of social citizenship have any effect on other kinds of citizenship rights, civil and political rights? Many people worry that a democracy cannot survive with enormous wealth inequalities. And how or should ideas about fairness, social responsibility, the common good, or distributive justice influence policies in this new ownership society? As I mentioned at the start of this talk, I came to the study of tax policy from my concern about feminist theories of the state. Now, feminist political theory long ago critiqued a notion of citizenship that presumed a white male propertied citizen, the very demographic that actually defined citizenship for much of American history. Just as this normative citizen cannot stand in for the millions of women, people of color, and property-less or property-poor citizens of this country, nor can the category of taxpayer generically do the same. What I've suggested today is that when you understand that taxpayers are differently socially located within the matrix of gender, race, and class relations, it becomes clear that it's important to analyze how people are differently affected by different kinds of tax policies. Differences of wealth and income make a lot of difference for which tax policies benefit which individuals. But it also makes a big difference for how people understand their own investment in different kinds of policies. Economic freedom sounds good, but as Janis Joplin's rendition of Chris Christopherson's lyrics in the 1971 hit song Me and Bobby McGee put it, for those with limited economic resources, freedom may be just another word for nothing left to lose. Sorry, that's dating myself, but it is a great song. It just was going through my mind, so I threw it in. Economic freedom in an inequitable society may not feel much like freedom to those who are exhorted to be personally responsible in the face of the withdrawal of public resources. Ask retirees living on Social Security or getting by or Medicare how unfree they feel when they use their Medicare and Social Security cards. Ask low-income students getting a college education how oppressed they feel by their dependence on low-interest government grants. Ask poor mothers of young children if they're desperate to escape their dependence on welfare, instead to go to a low-wage job without health insurance. Citizenship is a socially and politically constructed concept, and in the case of many of the protections that social citizenship entails, they've been won through a lot of hard social movement struggle. For many people, dependence on the government under the ownership society is certainly replaced by dependence solely on the market. So it's not that dependency is gone, it's where one is dependent for an income. I am going to skip that because I want to have more time for questions, and I was going to talk about one other thing, but I won't. So let me conclude. We live during a historical period and a culture that I think is characterized by what I call an ethical division of labor, where considerations of ethics and morality are defined as appropriate for talking about social issues, but not when the issues have to do with the economy, as in tax policy. So we have that nice ethical division of labor where some people think about ethics and some people don't. But tax policy is and always has been laden with questions of value, worth, and fairness. Unfortunately, most of us aren't tax literate enough or have access to the tables where tax policy gets hammered out to ensure that these kinds of issues of fairness and equity are being talked about in terms of tax policy. Not so long ago, in the immediate aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, there was a lot of political discussion, really for the first time in this country in a while, about economic justice and what it does mean to abandon people to their own personal resources, what it means to abandon communities of people in need, communities that don't just happen to be poor, of color, and disproportionately female, or very young, or very old. Many of the issues raised by the unnatural disaster that accompanied Katrina have everything to do with tax policy and with conceptions of the role of the state and with what happens when public infrastructure and services and resources are inadequately funded and regulated. In an article interestingly enough called A New Deal, remember the New York Times title, by journalist William Greider, he summed up the questions that Katrina raised for him this way. Must the country continue to give precedence to private financial gain and market determinism over human lives and broad public values? Or shall we now undertake a radical restoration on behalf of society and people? These are the kinds of questions that I'm curious about, that I organized this lecture series and seminar series in the spring to talk about. In order to actively participate in public debates about tax and other fiscal policy, more of us need to become tax literate. We need to revive the long tradition in both mainstream and radical political and economic theory of thinking about the economy not in terms of natural laws or inevitable dynamics, but as a subject of moral and ethical concern. So maybe that's what we can do in the last half hour. Thanks.
We're open for questions right now, but we're media siding this, so if you raise your hand, I'll bring you the mic.
I'm curious about your impressions of the Act 1 tax relief. It doesn't appear to be any relief to anyone.
I have been studying the State College Local Tax Study Commission, which is what she's talking about, for people that don't know, is that last spring the legislature in Pennsylvania mandated that every school district appoint a tax study commission that would then make a recommendation to give people property tax relief by dollar for dollar replacing certain property tax monies with either an earned income or a personal income tax increase. The earned income tax increase would be income from wages. The personal income tax increase would include investment income, capital gains, interest, dividends, etc. So what happened here in State College, I was, by the way, the only member of the public that attended every one of these meetings, all 7 of them. It's almost like I was on the tax commission, is that the tax commission was divided. They voted for a personal income tax increase, 2 for an earned income tax increase, and 2 for no change. And what was very interesting about, and I'm going to get to the larger question in a minute, what was very interesting is, at the public hearing, almost everyone that spoke wanted to have a personal income tax increase. And they wanted to have it be on the personal income tax because it's fairer. It is fairer, objectively, and people knew that it was fairer. The people that on the tax commission who did not want to go for the personal income tax increase, who went for either earned or no, did it for the very reasons that it's just so classic, and many of the reasons are legitimate. They thought it was going to be really just too hard to figure out how to tax personal income at the local and state level, and it is actually quite hard to do it. And there were not adequate provisions in the Act. They weren't sure exactly how this tax would be collected. So for reasons of efficiency, they chose not to support it. Others chose not to support it because they just did not want to see that kind of income taxed. We've really moved in this society to a belief that when you have income from investments, it's really kind of precious, and it really shouldn't be taxed the same way that wage income should be taxed. And so there was a series of discussions about that. I just today, all of you will receive, when you go home, you will get, is his name Lynn Herman? He was the head of the committee that did the legislation that led to Act 1. He's talking very proudly about this property tax shift. Fundamentally, it's not, first of all, it's not going to happen, probably. Most localities will vote against it because most people won't have any idea what it is, because many local tax commissions are going to recommend voting against it. And I've seen a list of the ones that have already come up with their recommendation. There's 500 some school districts in the state. Only about 60 have already posted their recommendation. 80% of them go for an earned as opposed to a personal income tax solution to property tax relief. Now, probably most of you don't understand a word of what I just said because it's such a complicated deal. But fundamentally, who's going to lose? Renters? Well, maybe, yeah, if we go to an earned income tax, yes, the poor. Renters get nothing. It's only for homeowners that are going to benefit. If we went to a personal income tax to relieve some of the property tax, in State College, everyone earning less than $75,000 would benefit. They would benefit a little or a lot, depending on whether they're homeowners. And everyone above $75,000 would lose. It doesn't look the same in all districts. I can't explain why. But so what do I think? I think that people hate property taxes, but they hate other taxes too. And it took this group of 8 citizens and me hours and hours and hours of experts walking us through what this was going to mean and what it would look like to grasp it, to come up with a recommendation. How most people are going to vote on something like this. They're going to vote on a kind of knee-jerk. They're going to vote because they don't want to pay this kind of tax and they don't want to pay that kind of tax.
Is there a logical, doable way to withhold or collect personal income tax from investment?
Yes. The state form, you have to, on the state form and on the federal form, all of that income is there. The issue is how it would be collected, how it would be certain that people were not evading their responsibilities. And because the legislature did not have all those things figured out before the tax study commissions had to do their work, people thought, oh my God, it's just going to be too complicated. And it is very complicated. But yes, it would be very possible to go to a personal income tax and use all the data that's already collected for the state form.
Is there a state in this country that does that?
There's another solution, and that's to set aside the issue of where the taxes come from and ask the question, what are they used for? Here it's mainly for schools. The main burden of that tax is for health care for the employees of the school system. That's because that is a market phenomenon. If that were provided by a single-payer health insurance system, that would remove the major cost, which is the cause of the tax burden. So I think people are looking at a hand over here talking about tax relief that's really confusing the main issue. I think it's a trick, in fact. And Professor Morgan talked about a paradigm change, and that brings me to my question. To what extent do you see this as a well-orchestrated, concerted campaign by corporate interests to confuse the American people and to make them do essentially stupid things that are against their own interests?
Well, I just gave a talk at the American Anthropology meetings where you were at the same time, and what that talk was on the big national anti-tax. I've done a study of the discourse of the 30-plus national anti-tax limited government organizations. I don't know if it's a concerted attempt to confuse the American people. I think it is a concerted attempt to convince the American people that taxes are bad, that government is bad, that they're better off with economic freedom, etc. Now, the whole issue of confusion does arise with the issue of the flat tax. There are, a lot of people just don't believe that anybody pays their fair, that the rich pay their fair share. And for that reason, there is actually a lot of support for a flat tax, which would be a terrible tax in terms of progressivity. Terrible. But a lot of people are so confused by the 50,000 pages, I am not joking, the 50,000 pages of the U.S. tax code, and the hundreds of tax exemptions, credits, etc., that they just say, okay, let's just have a flat tax and not have all this stuff. I really do, I wouldn't have begun this project of studying these national anti-tax organizations if I didn't think that they had played and were playing a very, very significant role in the changing of the political discourse around taxes. And it's amazing how effective they've been. I hope that answered your question.
That was a great talk, and I just have a couple of quick follow-ups. First of all, partial response to the last question. I had the chance to look at something called the Luntz Group guide for Republicans in the 2004 election, in which they were instructed to emphasize how incredibly long the tax code was, to emphasize the need for simplicity, to emphasize the need for tax relief, as though it's some burden that we unjustifiably bear. So I think there are political forces at work here, but my question is, to what extent is the burden on women in the U.S. greater than it is in other nations, and has much work been done on that field?
You mean the tax burden?
The tax burden, yeah.
Well, it's less than for many women in Europe because taxes are lower, but that's a little bit of a trick, because one of the things that's problematic about how we talk about taxes in this country is that we talk about taxes separately from what we get from taxes. in the legislatures of our states and in the Congress, totally different committees deal with taxes and with budgets. It's like they're not even related, except when you have to cut something, because what the guys over there did. So I think that because many European countries, not yours, but many of the others, have very generous, well, England is as bad, and Scotland, I mean, they're as bad as the United States in terms of welfare state programs, but you know, in much of Scandinavia, France, Germany, etc., there's many more universal programs, and in order to pay for those things, taxes are higher than they are here in many of these countries. So the proportional burden to women has to be examined in terms of both the costs and the benefits, in my opinion. You had another question, you said, or no?
Oh, actually, yeah, just one separate question. I was really sort of concerned, as concerned I am about the thrust of your presentation, the thought at the end that maybe this has some implications for civil and political rights too. Can you just expand on that, how this sort of negation of social citizenship or social responsibility might also have an effect on civil and political rights?
I'm being very speculative here. We already have a political participation rate in elections in this country that is so much lower than most places. And those who are least likely to vote are poor people. The lower income, the lower the electoral participation has been for quite a long time. Why? Cynicism, the sense that there's nothing to be gained, that it doesn't really matter, that this guy is as bad as this guy, which is not always true. So it's not, in this case, there's actually a fairly correct reading on the part of many people that their vote may not make such a big difference in terms of their fundamental day-to-day needs, because as you know, I focused on the Bush tax cuts, and you know, I really do actually believe that the parties are different on taxes, but they're not that different on tax policy, and a lot of problematic tax policies were passed under Clinton, Kennedy, etc., especially Kennedy. That's one thing, is sort of how it mutes political participation. I think the other thing that's going on right now that I didn't talk about is that spending priorities are shifting so much towards the military, towards homeland security, etc., and there's a way in which people sort of follow the money, and there's been, as you well know, a kind of growing sense of accommodation to the loss of civil liberties, and a lot of that's coming out of the same kind of discourse. You've got to have economic freedoms, you've got to have, you know, it's a kind of, to the extent that economic freedoms are so highly prioritized, there seems to, people are sort of substituting that for, you know, the very deep, and I still think well-embedded desire to have political and civil rights as well. Civil rights, the right to have an abortion, the right to, you know, to sort of go to school, to go to college, etc. If you can't pay for these things, equality of those kinds of equalities need money behind them, and so we will have a more polarized populace the more we don't provide subsidies for people at the bottom to be able to have the kind of so-called equality of opportunity that this country's rhetoric focuses on.
Thank you. Actually, you don't have to be quite as speculative. There's a national report just came out about a month ago, and it's not in terms of civil and political rights, but in terms of the civic divide and participation, which was always bad, as you noted, but it's actually grown. They've documented in the last 20 years, pretty much over the same period, that the economic opportunity, economic disparities have been growing. But I have a separate question, and it goes to the sort of neoliberal argument. So if we bought into the notion that the tax burden should be lowered such that invest consumption, isn't there a sort of level at which you have so much money you can't consume and invest anymore? Well, maybe you can invest, but I mean, I mean, there's only so much money you can do much with, right? And so isn't there an economic breakdown in the argument in terms of, taking away the tax burden for investment and consumption purposes?
I'm going to answer that in three ways. First, to say I'm not an economist and somebody else probably could do a better job. But there's two things I can say to that. First of all, in the last recession, the 2001 recession that for many people continues to be a recession but was called off a year or two ago, just like the war was called off, remember? In that period of time, which was characterized by two very significant tax cuts, economic growth has not, the growth in jobs, depends how you define economic growth. If you define economic growth in terms of the creation of jobs, which is the way most of us want to have it defined, job growth is very sluggish in this recession, despite the largest tax cuts in years. Job growth has been the most significant during some of the periods when taxes were very, very high. It's not all about taxes. Okay, so that's the first thing. In terms of, is there a point? Well, we've sort of reached that point to some level, to some degree, because where a lot of investments are going is outside of this country. There's a tremendous amount of capital flowing outside, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but part of the reason for globalization and for this sort of neoliberal concern for free trade, and particularly the mobility of finance capital, is because there's so much money that needs to be invested, and there's not any more, it can't all be done in these borders. Free trade is crucial to the expenditure of the excess profits that you brought up. And believe me, they're finding homes. But some of the homes they're finding are, if you go to Jamaica, if you go to Haiti, if you go to many countries in Africa, as large corporations invest in these other places, small business owners and farmers are being basically, are losing their livelihoods because they can't compete. They can't compete with these large corporations. So the problems of, and by the way, the problems of economic polarization are much greater than in the U.S. The differences are tremendous globally. So did that answer your question?
Can I also ask a question about the concept of fiscal welfare and how it's being received, and is it having the kind of impact you were hoping in terms of reframing it as a welfare? And can you speak to that?
Well, we had a little trouble with this concept in terms of, even when we wrote the book for the National Council for Research on Women, there was a lot of debate about whether this was the best way to define this concept. There is the assumption that, well, if we called it something else, people would feel better about it. Nobody really likes welfare and that kind of thing. I don't know if we made the right choice in terms of the sort of policy, trying to get through to policy people. But I do think it's very, both Mimi and I came to studying taxes through studying social welfare. So we're all about trying to, we really see them as very interrelated kinds of systems. I believe to the core of my being that this concept is true and accurate. Whether it is politically the best way to frame this, whether it's going to resonate with a lot of people, we'll have to see. How do you all feel? Does it resonate with you, or do you want to say find some other term? I mean, you're my test cases.
Actually, that was, excuse me, not really a question, but I guess somewhat. With the term welfare itself has become such a negative term. On one side, I see that the use of saying fiscal welfare could possibly attempt to maybe bring welfare out of being seen as a negative term,
That was
which is what I
part
think
of
the point was.
Mm-hmm.
But what I fear, I guess, in a way, is could it possibly tinge fiscal welfare to be negative as well? Because I think that fiscal welfare can be a very positive thing also, especially through I always forget what it's called.
Earned income tax.
Yes, the earned income tax credit. So I guess my question really goes to is how possibly could would it be better to possibly find a different way of framing the whole debate and try and throw out the term welfare in ways of looking at possibly government expenditures or I don't know, wealth protective, so I have no idea, but that's the concern, I guess, is that I've seen welfare become such a negative term, and I think that I don't know how fiscal welfare will resonate.
Yeah, we already have the concept out there of corporate welfare, which is fiscal welfare, and that term hasn't done so well. I mean, it's done well with a very small group of progressive people, but so.
Sandy, Jonathan Kozol talks about how the most terrible thing about urban education is that it's funded by property taxes. Do you see any movement to try to get public education funded a different way? And do you agree with him that that is the reason why a kid growing up in Harlem can be sure that he's not going to get a decent education? And
that's a really complicated question. I do think he's right that property tax, having a property tax base for education is problematic as long as we have the kind of class and race segregation that we have in housing in this country. But having lived for 15 years in Oregon, where we had a major property tax limitation measure passed in 1990 that required the state general funds to make up for the decrease in property tax revenues for the schools, I can tell you that there are some major problems that emerge there, and they are primarily that when funding for public education gets put in the same pot with human service, public safety, government operations, roads, etc., some pretty gnarly things happen politically. On the one hand, public education is more popular than most of those things, and so what happened in Oregon is public education became more popular and the other things got cut more and had to be cut more because of the particular way you don't have to do it that way. That's how they did it. So that's one thing that happens. The other thing that happens is you get public sector workers sort of not feeling that we're all in it together, but you get the teachers on one side saying, we've got to do right by these kids, which also means doing right by them, and then the you get divisions among the groups that probably really ought to be seeing themselves as allies in being sure that all public services are adequately funded. So Kozol's right, Oregon's wrong. I think the answer probably lies along the lines Paul was talking about, in that if we collected revenues in a really progressive way at the state, local, and federal level, and if we changed spending priorities, we probably wouldn't have the problem Kozol's talking about. But we're a long way from that. We're actually going, as I've said, in the other direction. So, but the differences in public schools based on property taxes are terrible. Texas, that's another example. What Texas tried to do an equalization, and it has been also very problematic. You don't really want to bring down the good schools in order to bring up the underfunded schools, and that is another thing that happens. So it's fixable, but not under the premises that we often operate under.
I'd just like to carry that another step and go back to your mention of Scandinavia and a different model for thinking about the whole matter. In this country, we think of rights in terms of the right to freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom to carry a gun and shoot people and animals, and so on. In Iceland, there are 5 constitutionally guaranteed rights. The right to a dignified retirement, the right to health care, the right to all of the education that you want, the right to housing, and
Work?
the right to a job. Thank you. These are rights, not privileges, not something you have to buy. They are guaranteed rights. You gain them by being a member of that country. Matter of fact, maybe we should just all go there.
Kind of a
But
little
that's another
country.
way of,
It's cold. I'm already cold enough here in State College, but
it's no colder than it gets here.
but I appreciate your point. And I want to thank you for, I know that it's hard to sit through these sort of tax things. I saw lots of people actually get up and leave. It's really not that hard unless you try and get into the super intricate details. And if you could do me one favor, which is tell your friends and neighbors that knowing something about taxes isn't that hard, that it's crucial for our citizenship rights to be better addressed. They can buy my book, Taxes Are a Women's Issue, if they want, but there's a lot of other websites, et cetera, that help people understand it. And aside from my scholarly interest in neoliberalism and et cetera, I really believe in a much more vigorous, informed public discussion of tax policy, whether it's Act 1, tax cuts, et cetera. So just, it hasn't been that bad, and you can tell your friends and neighbors, hey, let's talk about taxes.
Please join me in thanking Professor Morgen.